There are not very many years that go by that there's not a new popular book about Jesus that dominates the market. And some are better than others. Though each would seem to have some redeeming qualities, none are, I think it's fair to say, either perfect, nor will any of them ever prove to be the last word on the topic. Reza Aslan has received a lot of media attention this spring and summer following the release of his book Zealot. Though Aslan now self-identifies as a Muslim, and he certainly gained a lot of notoriety for his publication on the history of Islam, No God But God, he presents in his book a fairly devotional, though non-divine view of the historical Jesus. In some ways, progressive Christians can find a natural ally in Muslim thinkers who affirmed over 1,000 years ago that Jesus was a prophet, but insisted that it is blasphemous to call any human God. We'll not find many practicing Muslims who don't still try to work Jesus into being a prophet of a supernatural theistic God, but there should still be some common ground for conversation between progressive Christians and Muslim scholars in the rejection of incarnational theology. At present, while Zealot is giving Aslan a forum to quote New Testament gospel passages as if they were reliable historical reports of what Jesus actually said, there's an even more radical group on the stage attempting to support the charge that Jesus never existed. They say that there wasn't even a village of Nazareth in the first century in Palestine, and that the entire Jesus narrative was made up by second century Roman aristocrats in order to create a religion that would just get the peasants to calm down a little bit. We cannot realistically just brush those skeptics aside. There is not much in the written historical record about Jesus, and there is no physical evidence whatsoever. Still, travelers to modern-day Jericho may be shown the sycamore tree that guides will tell them is the sycamore tree that Zacchaeus climbed up to for that famous encounter in Luke 19 between Jesus and Zacchaeus. Tour guides can show you etchings in the pavement in Jerusalem, or even an old building that they say is the upper room, to thrill tourists with the prospect of walking where Jesus actually walked, or drawing near to absolute historical evidence of gospel accounts. For more on this, I can only refer you to that proverb that was mistakenly attributed to P.T. Barnum: there is a sucker born every minute. But most of us have, at one time or another, fallen prey to being suckers for a good Jesus story, because we so wanted to believe that our pastors, our priests, our Sunday school teachers, our parents, our peers had told us the truth. Though I suspect that there was a village known as Nazareth that was a poor Jewish suburb of Sepphoris, a much larger city of blended Greek and Palestinian people, it is impossible to prove from currently extant written records or archaeological finds with absolute certainty that there was a Nazareth. I think there probably was one. I am disinclined to jump off the cliff with the skeptics and say that Jesus is entirely a literary creation, but honesty compels us to acknowledge that most of the Jesus tradition is a matter of conjecture, tradition, and certainly of false attribution. More than a century of sincere and scholarly research into the historical Jesus has resulted in several quite plausible images of this Palestinian religious figure, and some scholars would insist that he was not religious. Most of what we know about Jesus, we do know from the Gospels we find in the New Testament, all of which were written to accomplish a theological goal, and none of which give us any eyewitness reports and were not written by contemporaries of Jesus. Possibly our best support that Jesus existed comes from the hand of the self-appointed apostle Paul. Paul never met Jesus and did not seem to have very much interest in the actual history of Jesus, the person, Jesus of Nazareth. However, Paul does report having gone to Jerusalem and met with the family and close friends of Jesus, with whom Paul was essentially a competitor. By his own reporting, his relationship with them was a little more strained than you might have hoped, and he was at considerable pains to make it clear that he didn't learn anything from them and didn't ask them any questions and is absolutely not indebted to those who actually might have had some real information about the Jesus traditions from firsthand. But Paul preached his own message. We could wish that Paul was a little more curious, a little less arrogant, but we have to depend on the Paul that we have and not the Paul we could wish for. Almost by accident, Paul gives us enough evidence to assume that Jesus, a Palestinian Jew, lived, taught, and made a lifelong impression on at least a few followers. It's not a stretch to say that were it not for Paul, probably none of us here would have ever heard of Jesus. The Jesus tradition may have been just a little brief blip on the radar of history had Paul not taken his name and a little sketchy background history to use as the language set for a mystery religion that Paul taught, which is really a synthesis of Jewish thought with Greek salvation and mystery religions, a creation of Paul's. What we can say with confidence is that the message that was central to Paul and the message that was central to Jesus have little or nothing to do with each other. It is evident that Jesus had a following that included at least one of his brothers and maybe two, and all of us who have brothers can testify to the fact that that is no small accomplishment. What Jesus said and did was sufficiently profound and meaningful to cause a following to remain intact after Jesus was dead. So there were those who repeated what he said, who told some stories about what he did, but those traditions only come down to us through obscure non-canonical sources such as the fragmentary saying source, the Gospel of Thomas, maybe something of the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Truth, and a few other Gnostic writings, and then the four Gospels that we know of the New Testament. Paul, as the first and most popular writer in the Christian tradition, undoubtedly influenced how all four Gospels were written. This is a really important point that you should read Paul's letters first. If you read, as Marcus Borg has recently suggested, if you read Christian literature in the order in which we think it was written, you see the evolution of the Jesus tradition within the canon of the Bible. We have a tendency, however, to read the Gospels first and then read Paul, and you miss entirely that the Gospels were written under the influence of Paul. No one writing any of the Gospels was not completely familiar with Paul, Paul's position, and Paul's perspective on the Jesus story. Mark is the oldest of the four Gospels, and each of the others were largely dependent on Mark's storyline. 20 years after the fact, Mark tells the Jesus story as a martyr's tale, a memorable one, and quite persuasive. Mark's narrative contains no virgin birth and no resurrection appearances. Matthew and Luke, written about 20 years after Mark, add virgin birth narratives that completely contradict each other, and they add some resurrection appearances which also have nothing in common with each other. Another generation passes, and the gospel attributed to John takes the final step in the evolution of Jesus into being literally the externally extant God. But Paul, the first known author to write about the resurrection of Jesus, describes the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15 only as a visionary event in which his own encounter with the resurrected Jesus was just like the encounter had by Peter, James, and John and the other Jerusalem witnesses. Paul never mentions an empty tomb, and he would not have believed that the dead body, the carcass of Jesus of Nazareth, had been transformed into the spiritual Christ, which is what Paul is really interested in. Mark's gospel gives us an empty tomb narrative, but not a resurrection. Matthew and Luke add resurrection appearances that are highly symbolic, and again, do not agree with each other. John adds resurrection appearance traditions in an even higher Christological term, raising Jesus from being human to a little more God and a little more God into absolutely God. Traditional Christianity has tended, for all of our lives and for much of history, to view all of the Gospels and Paul through the lens of the least reliable source we have, which is John. We have made John the center point of understanding the Jesus narrative. So we start with this God-man and don't even get to hear the human implications that are present in the earlier part of the tradition. Since we know almost nothing about the historical Jesus, and since we acknowledge that there is no incarnation, substitutionary death, or creedal path into a glorious afterlife, why then is Jesus still important to us? The unsettling but honest answer is that Jesus is only important to us if we choose to gift him with that importance. There is no supernatural theistic deity demanding a blood sacrifice to save us from eternal damnation. Progressives then see Jesus as being one of the many historical characters around whose name a body of spiritual teachings has been collected. We know the names of many others, and there are thousands more that have contributed to human spiritual evolution whose names we could not call off the top of our heads. The religion that claims the Jesus tradition, Christianity, has been numerically successful for largely political and sociological reasons, only partially because of the content of the collection of the Jesus sayings. But once we are liberated from a controlling ecclesiological authority or the darkness of pre-modern superstitions, we recognize that what draws us into a spiritual life is a desire for truth, for meaning, for insight into how to be a good person. Now the guiding issue is, does the Christian tradition have something to offer the 21st century? And if it does, what is it? Of the major academic trends in historical Jesus studies, several paths do not lead us to a Jesus that offers us very much. If Jesus was only a reformer of first century Judaism, then while he may have some interest to historians, we would never be inclined to quote him as an authority in our own lives. Even those who try to temper theological excesses with the more realistic historical boundaries, I read a lot of these guys, and I find them to be trying to somehow keep a foot in both camps. They maintain a certain fealty to the institutional church's need to at least suggest, hint at, hold open the possibility to there being a supernatural theistic God who intervenes in human history, and that Jesus somehow had a unique and peculiar relationship with that deity. I appreciate the helpful steps offered to the evolution of progressive faith by some of these authors who have helped to build a bridge between traditional Christianity and more progressive faith, but I cannot convince myself that there is a future for Christianity in the 21st century that asks modern people to accept the unverifiable truth claims of traditional orthodoxy. Extraordinary claims, as Carl Sagan has said, demand extraordinary evidence. And there is no evidence for the existence of a heaven, a hell, a trinity, souls, angels, demons, or personal God who is out there somewhere. There is no evidence. The claim that the sacrifice of Jesus is the necessary and the only way to a right relationship with God is the most extraordinary claim ever made. But there's not extraordinary evidence. There's not even modest evidence. There is no evidence. While Gospels written long after Jesus' death by people who had never met him record accounts of miraculous events, all of the way from changing water into wine to restoring life to the dead, we have no reason to take these accounts as being factual, literal, historical events. We can, however, find a great deal of moral insight and even personal inspiration if we will let ourselves read them for what they are. Messages about life, inspiration for spiritual instruction. That's what they were written to be. That's what they are, and that's the use that they have to offer us. There are good reasons to conclude that the Jesus of history may have only been interested in speaking to Galilean Jews. I mean, the real guy, the actual Jesus of Nazareth, may have had no interest in anyone in this room. We, however, are only interested in how the Jesus tradition applies to every nation and race of modern society. A credible case could be made for arguing that the Jesus of history may have actually been something of a racist, but the Jesus tradition that interests us is a tradition that extols harmony among all nations, races, and people. The historical Jesus may or may not have believed in an imminent apocalyptic end to history. If he did, he was wrong. And if he didn't, well, we also don't believe in a superstitious or divine apocalypse caused by God entering history and destroying the universe, but we do face several forms of potential apocalypse, from warfare, from disease, from pollution, from economic collapse. And so any spiritual insight that we can gain from the Jesus tradition about how to avoid the real apocalypse, as opposed to the imaginary spiritual apocalypse, is really going to be very helpful to us. The Jesus of the later church, once thoroughly turned into a spiritual Christ cartoon of salvation from a mythical hell, has been useful for 2,000 years, useful to both institutional religion and to empire-building governments. But for progressives, we can safely say that this is the mental and emotional prison from which we have declared ourselves to be liberated. There are three things that I propose keep us tethered to Jesus. And in ascending order of importance, I suggest that we continue to talk about Jesus because the Christian traditions help us to understand ourselves through rituals around birth, coming of age, marriage, illness, and death, and in the process of living within families and societies. Secondly, as I will discuss in a later chapter, a religion gives us a language set of stories, parables, ideas that allow us to communicate with each other about meaningful living. For many of us, the Christian scriptures and stories, the traditions of Jesus in the Gospels, form an irreplaceable base of mutual understanding. It's a meeting place where we can come to exchange ideas. But finally, and most importantly, between the stripped-down view of the historical Jesus and the exalted presentation of the magical Christ, there is a Jesus who stands up in history as a loving advocate of the poor, the sick, and the vulnerable, who simultaneously challenged the power and abuse of the rich and of the empire or any empire. The canonical Gospels were written when the Roman Empire had already really won its battle for dominance of the Jews, and as far as they were concerned, the known universe. Still, we find in subtle ways a distinct anti-empire thread in how they tell the story. The exaggerated titles heaped up on Jesus in the evolving Christologies of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and finally John, are also the exaggerated titles that were heaped up on the emperor, the Caesar, who was called Savior, Son of God, Lord. And some were even given the tradition of a virgin birth, as were certain other influential philosophers and artists. There is a distinct and undeniable way in which that part of the Jesus tradition is offered as an alternative to cowering before wealth and power. There is the point at which saying that Jesus is Lord is a way of saying that Caesar is not Lord, nor is the President of the United States, nor is the Supreme Court, nor is Halliburton, or Morton Thiokol, or General Dynamics, or GE, or Bank of America. They are not Lord. We have chosen a different Lord who represents our interest, who represents the weak speaking the truth to power. In our day, the coercion, deception, manipulation, and abuse of governments and corporations demands an alternative. A renewed devotion to the truth is the best antidote to the manipulation of the corporate media. A spiritual sense of connection to the poor, to war refugees, the uninsured, the uneducated, and the hopeless is the best response we can give to an economic system that continues to transfer the resources that should be fairly spread among the people of the world into the hands of a smaller and smaller super elite. Jesus, as the teacher of radical compassion and self-sacrifice devotion to the truth, continues to be a symbol of the kind of spiritual depth we must claim as our own if we intend to transform the world into ways that actually does bring good news to the poor and as a bulwark against the abuses of power. Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.